That was Tame Impala singing Elephant, and welcome to the Wild Side with Kight. This week we are going to be talking about elephants, and the theme was inspired by some of the courses that I've been teaching or helping teach with up at Tremont at the University of Exeter. And this is actually the reason that I have not been broadcasting live for the last couple of weeks, because I've been teaching and so I've been quite busy, and I've had to come in late at night and pre-record for you guys. But luckily this week I happen to be free, so I can be live in the studio again. And I'm glad to be able to talk a little bit about something that we're talking about in class up at Tremont, because it's nice to have you guys get kind of an insight about what happens up there and what sorts of things the students are learning about, because the university is a big part of the area, and often I think people don't really know what it is that our students are being taught. And in this case we're talking about kids that are in the biodiversity and conservation course. And these guys have to read papers and engage in discussion groups and think about the issues from lots of different angles. And in this particular case, these guys are, they were reading about elephants and the ivory trade, and this topic is tied in with the upcoming field trips that we have to South Africa and to Kenya. So today I'll be talking about the contents of some of the papers that we assign them to read, but also some of the contextual materials that are important for kind of understanding why all this scientific and conservation research is interesting. So the biology of elephants is where I'm going to start off today, because it is quite important to understand, why are elephants biologically interesting and relevant, and then we can start to think about how some of the elephants' characteristics might make them particularly prone to conservation issues, and why it is there might be some human-elephant conflicts. And finally, why also we might want to actually think about saving elephants, not just because we happen to like them, but also because they are a really important part of the ecosystem. So elephants, as you may already know, are the heaviest terrestrial animal, and some of these guys can actually weigh up to 8 tons, although that does depend on the species. They're also the second tallest, and you can probably guess that the giraffe is the very tallest, but even a large full-grown male elephant can be up to 14 feet tall, which is pretty impressive. And there are both Asian and African elephants, and they're both in an order that kind of pays tribute to their most prominent feature, which is, I think, their trunk. So they're in the proboscidea, which, comes from proboscis, meaning nose. So first of all, the Asian elephants, or Elephas maximum, there are actually 10 different species in the same order with the Asian elephants, but all of those guys are already extinct. And those include things like the dwarf elephants that were found on islands. And they're kind of famous because it is quite an unusual concept to think about a very small elephant. But we do have, luckily, this one species of Asian elephant that is still around. And these guys are closely related to the mammoth, even though the Asian elephant are actually a bit smaller than their African counterparts. So you might actually think that it's the African elephants that are more likely to be related to these quite large furry elephants that we had up in the kind of Palearctic region. So currently, within the Asian elephant species, we have several different subspecies, and these are all related to where the animals live. So we have a Sri Lankan elephant, the Indian elephant, the Sumatran elephant, and also the Malayan elephant. Now formerly, these guys were all over the place, so they were south of the Himalayas, throughout Southeast Asia, and all the way up into China, up to the Yangtze River. But now they're only found in a few kind of remote parts throughout Southeast Asia. So places like India and Sri Lanka, Burma, Thailand, Laos, Vietnam, Malaysia, Sumatra, and of course Borneo. And all of these Asian elephants prefer scrub forests, places where they can find a mixture of grass and low kind of woody, shrubby type plants, and also forests. So all of these things mixed together in one place. Now, you can tell them apart from African elephants if you kind of look at a few of these guys and start to get a feel for their characteristics. The Asian elephants are smaller in general, even though there will be some overlap. They have ears that are straight at the bottom instead of kind of rounded and fan-shaped as we see in the African. And in these guys, only some of the individuals will have tusks. So females don't have tusks at all, and some of the males will have tusks, but others won't. And that's partly because there was already natural variation that meant that only some of the males had tusks, but also because they have been hunted very extensively for quite a long time, and so now they're genetically predisposed to have more individuals that don't ever grow tusks, since that's what makes them kind of susceptible to hunting. Now if you're really close up, or if you have a very nice pair of binoculars, You might also notice that these guys have 4 toes on their back foot and 5 on their forefoot. And as I describe African elephants in a bit, you'll notice that this is something that can distinguish them from their African relatives. And also with respect, relative to the African relatives, the skin of the Asian elephants tends to be a bit smoother, but if you look at it up close, you'll notice that it also has lots of freckles, which is something you don't normally see so much on the African elephants, which is kind of interesting because the African elephants, obviously, since they're out on the savannah, many of them, they're going to be exposed to more sun, so that's kind of a funny thing. But I guess the African elephants would have evolved away from just lots of little freckles to having a total overall darker skin tone. So what's kind of amazing about Asian elephants, and also about the African counterparts as well, is that they can consume massive amounts of food. So something like maybe 300 pounds of food in a day. And this is in a place, these Southeast Asian environments, where there's quite a lot of habitat degradation going on and habitat removal. And so it's pretty impressive that these guys are able to find this much food, even though there is all of this change that's going on with their habitats. Now, the African elephants, they also have different subspecies, but also there are 2 species of elephant in Africa. And this was something that was only fairly recently understood. So people used to think that there just happened to be one species of elephant where some of them tended to like the forest and some of them tended to like the savanna. But actually we now know that these are 2 distinct species, not only because of their habitat preferences, but also we can see that they have differences in morphology. So Loxodonta africana is the African bush elephant, and these are the guys that are a bit larger of the 2 species in Africa, and they also have noticeably larger tusks most of the time. Loxodonta cyclotis, which is the one that was more recently found to actually be a distinct species rather than just a subspecies, this is the African forest elephant, and these guys are the smaller of the 2, which makes sense if you think about the fact that they have to navigate through a bunch of kind of thick growth and vegetation in the forest, and so they're going to need to be a bit smaller to manage to get around. They also have a longer and narrower mandible, and this is something that has evolved because of the fact that they do target slightly different types of food. And they have rounder ears that tend to be a bit more distinct from those of both the African bush elephant and of the Asian elephant, which of course, as I said, has that kind of straight bottomed ear. So the forest elephant, it has feet like the Asian elephant, whereas the bush elephant has 3 toes on the hind foot and 4 on the front foot. This is quite a difficult characteristic for anyone to actually see out in the field, particularly because there are hybrids, and so you do see kind of a mixture of these traits. But it's just kind of a funny thing that you would have a difference in this characteristic that doesn't really seem to be all that important. And it actually is kind of reminiscent of the patterns that I mentioned in flamingos, which you might remember from a few weeks ago. And flamingos also have a couple of species that have a different number of hind toes. So it's just kind of a funny little quirk that happened as these species were evolving. So historically, the African elephants were found south of the Sahara Desert, all the way down to the tip of southern Africa and what we now know as South Africa, and all the way from one side of the continent to the other, so all the way from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. But now we see that the populations are much more limited. So they're found mostly in protected areas of national parks and also in game reserves, although some of them do kind of wander a bit more freely. And obviously because there are countries now that have distinct borders and they might have fences and other kind of obstacles in the way, these animals, which are migratory, and I'll go over that a bit in the future, this can cause some issues with where they go and whether they have access to it, because they do now have things that are in their way, preventing them from going to where they would normally be distributed. So like their Asian counterparts, the African elephants are herbivorous, but these guys are mostly grazers. So they tend to eat things that are nice and soft and on the ground, so things like grasses and other forbs. But like their Asian counterparts, they will also eat leaves and roots, barks and fruits, all sorts of things, depending on what season it is and what's available. And because these guys are quite a lot bigger, and because they do target slightly different types of food, they actually end up consuming a whole lot more in each day. So they can need up to 660 pounds or so of food in a single day. And they can also drink quite a lot as well, so up to 190 liters of water. So the needs of these animals is they're really extensive, and this can be a severe constraint on where they can be found, because they obviously need to go to places that have quite a lot of stuff around. Now interestingly, and I'll kind of talk about this also in a bit more detail, dying elephants can often be found in swampy areas that regularly elephants would try to avoid, because these areas don't have very good vegetation. However, the veg that is there is quite a bit softer, so it's easier to eat. And as these guys age and they start missing their teeth, then it can be nice for them to go to these swampy areas where they can find food that is something they can actually manage to chew on and get some nutrition out of. That was Pure Bathing Culture with Ivory Coast. So we are talking about elephants today, and I've just given you a bit of background about the different species of elephant that exist, and now it's time to talk about these wonderful animals in a bit more detail. So if someone were to say elephant to you, I think there are probably two things that you immediately think of. The first is their trunks, and the second is their tusks. And these are definitely the two major identifying characteristics of the animals, other than, of course, their size. So the trunks are long, boneless noses that extend basically from their upper lip. And if you look at a trunk distinctly from the rest of the elephant's body, you'll find that alone these things can weigh about 300 pounds, and they can grow up to 5 feet long. So they're pretty impressive structures, all on their own. And the projections on the tip are extremely dexterous, and they can actually be used to pick up something as small as a single blade of grass. And they're also quite strong, so in addition to be able to pick up these tiny little things, they can pick up very heavy things as well. So some elephants are capable of picking up at least 600 pounds worth of load just with their trunks. Now in Asian elephants, if you get to be up close and personal and look at the tip of the trunk, you'll notice that there's actually only one projection at the top rather than two. And again, this has to do with kind of what they're eating and the way that they're using their trunks. And they really only need to have this one long projection that can kind of curl around things to pick it up, as opposed to two projections that can be used to pinch in the way that we might do with our index finger and thumb. And as I've kind of already indicated, trunks can be used in lots of different ways. They can pick up objects, they can be used to trumpet and make acoustic sounds. They can greet other individuals, so elephants will kind of wave their trunks around in the same way that we might wave to someone that we see across the road. They can use them as a hose for drinking or bathing. And they can actually do lots of this stuff even within a zoo setting if you guys can go see them in captivity, because not a lot of people get to actually see them out in the wild. You can see them use their trunks for all these lots of various different things. And as I'll talk about a little bit later, they can even use them to hold a paintbrush and produce works of art. Now the tusks are the other kind of major identifying characteristic, and these guys are made of dentine, and basically they are like teeth. And in fact, the tusks are teeth. They are long incisors that just continue to grow throughout an animal's life. And so if you see an individual that has really long tusks, then it's probably quite an old animal. And you'll notice if you, well, you probably won't ever get up quite close enough to notice this, hopefully, but elephants will also have 4 other teeth. And these are all molars. So they have 2 on the upper and 2 on the lower jaw. And their molars are all replaced 7 times throughout their lives. So they have lots of different sets just waiting, and as soon as one set starts to wear down, they get replaced with another one. And in some cases, elephants do actually live long enough to go through all of their teeth, and at that point, when they've gone through all 7 sets, they have nothing else to replace them, and they end up basically starving to death because they don't have teeth to chew their food with. Now, all of the tusks are rooted in the cranium, so they are quite deeply embedded, and that's why it's very unlikely that you would ever see an elephant poached for ivory and not killed, because in order to extract all of the ivory, the poachers would actually have to make sure that they've killed the animal and remove the ivory from basically the skull. And these can grow up to 8 feet long and weigh over 130 pounds apiece. So like the trunks, these are extremely large and very heavy body parts. And just like us, you'll find that elephants can be either left or right-sided. And so they will have one dominant side and use the tusk on that side to help them do things. And so you'll often notice, if you're looking at these guys, that there will be more wearing on the side that is the side that they're dominant on. And that's because they're using it more and more relative to the other one, and so it starts to wear down over time. Now I mentioned earlier that female Asian elephants don't have tusks, But they do still have large incisors. They just don't ever grow to quite the same extent of those of the males. And these are called tushes, and they are hidden under the upper lip. So if you get up close and personal, which I keep saying in this kind of optimistic way, like you might have a chance to meet an elephant in the wild, although actually if you do it's quite scary because they can be very violent. But if you do find yourself in that position, you might notice that tucked up under the upper lip of those Asian elephants is a pair of kind of slightly long teeth or very long tusks, however you want to think about it. Now, of course, elephants are also known for their wrinkly gray skin, and this is scattered with lots of little prickly black hairs, which you might notice, especially in the case of the African elephant. And the skin can be really thick. It's actually 2.5 inches or 2 to 4 centimeters, whichever measuring system you prefer. But amazingly, there are insects that are out there that have evolved to have such strong mouth parts or stingers that they can actually get to the elephants through this incredibly thick skin, which is kind of scary if you think about ever going out into the wild on your own, because that is definitely an insect that you would not want to meet. Now, something else the elephants are very well known for is having quite a complex social organization. And their groups tend to revolve around females, which are also known as cows, and the female's offspring, which are known as calves. And these groups are led by matriarchs. And the matriarch is generally going to be the oldest female in the group, and she tends to lead a clan of about 5 to 11 elephants that are kind of the core individuals. However, the herd in general can reach up to 200 elephants on kind of a regular basis, or even up into the thousands during the rainy season. Now, I've been out to Kenya a few times, luckily enough, because I've helped to chaperone the field courses up at the University of Exeter, and of all the times that I've been, I think the biggest group I've ever seen is 50, but it would be really impressive to see one of these groups of hundreds or even thousands of elephants all together. And these herds that form are non-territorial, so basically they just have to keep roaming, and that's why they don't really want to maintain a territory, because they eat so much food, and there are so many of them all eating that food together, that they basically just have to keep on the move and keep finding patches where there is something to eat, and then let the old patches kind of regenerate so they can eventually come back to them when there is stuff there to eat again. Now, the matriarchs are responsible for making the decisions about what these groups of individuals will do. So they decide when it's time to eat or rest or have a bath, have a drink. So basically they will look around and kind of see what's best for the herd at any given time and pursue that course of action. And there are even documented instances where a matriarch has kind of clearly realized that one of the group's individuals is maybe too old or too infirm to contribute and is maybe slowing down the rest of the group or somehow endangering it. And she seems to kind of clearly show that this individual needs to stay behind in order to make sure that the group will go on and be safe and secure. And people have observed these individuals who have been picked out to actually accept this fate and go off on their own. So the matriarchs do have quite a lot of power, and they're able to communicate their desires basically to the other elephants around them and kind of coordinate these massive group activities. If you're wondering what the males are doing during all this time, basically most of the males live in isolation or kind of semi-isolation. And these guys, as you might expect, are known as bulls. So basically we use all the same terminology as we do in cows and other kind of familiar ungulates. Now, bulls will leave the herd when they reach puberty, and at this time they start kind of getting into lots of fights and acting kind of grumpy, and so they're eventually driven out by their mothers because the mothers realize that they no longer need help, they just need to go off and be on their own and start to think about kind of beefing themselves up and getting ready to basically attract females, which they won't do for quite a long time. So what they're really trying to do is get into enough shape that they can beat out other males to attract the females. So during this time, once they're on their own, they will maintain loose relationships with other males. So you might see them kind of occasionally in the near proximity of some other males, especially when they're a bit younger and they haven't gotten too sexually mature and too active and interested in getting the ladies. Because once they do start to want to woo females, they will fight over them, and so they can't be too friendly with each other. So they don't become reproductively active until they're in their 30s. And basically this is when they become large enough to be able to compete with other established adult males for access to females. And they enter a state of basically heightened sexual aggression and activity that's called must. And during this time, they will go around. It's something that you actually see in deer and other animals as well, kind of like a rut type season. And they get very excited and very angry, and they just want to charge anything that comes into their pathway, basically. And they'll go around smelling females in order to see if females are ready to reproduce, because females do emit a smell once they're in estrus and can actually mate and become pregnant. And in order to do this, the males will take their trunk and rub it up against the female, the tip of the trunk, and then they'll take the tip and put it in their mouths, and that allows them to kind of taste / smell using their chemical receptors. So it's kind of an interesting thing, because you tend to think of the trunk as acting like a nose, but in fact they aren't just sniffing through the end of the trunk, but then tasting it as well in their mouths. And the males are constantly on the move, roaming around trying to find reproductive females. And they rarely stay with any group of females for more than a few weeks. So once they've mated and the female has become pregnant, the males then take off and try to find another female instead. So for elephant reproduction, you'll find that there's actually no specific mating season. But like a lot of animals in kind of tropical places and places around the equator, they do tend to have more breeding during the rainy season, or at least more breeding activities during this time. Females don't become reproductively active until they're about a decade old, so something like 10 to 12 years depending on the species. And even once that has happened, they only give birth every 4 or 5 years. And since most of these guys will live to be something like 50 to 65 years old, depending on the species and the sex, this means that an individual female will produce maybe about 7 offspring throughout their lives. And Asian elephants do have a bit of a longer lifespan, so they might be a little bit more productive. Now when the females are ready to mate, they're actually only in estrus for about 2 days, and so this means that the males really do have to act quickly. And this is something else that's a really good reason for them to roam around quite a lot, because there are only going to be so many females ready at any given time, and it's quite a short period that they are ready, so the males have to be able to find them as quickly as possible. Now something that a lot of kids do learn about elephants when they're quite young is that these have the longest gestation period of any mammal, and I remember learning this when I was young, and it's actually just under 2 years, so it's about 22 months. And this allows the young to be born precocial, which means that they can do lots of things on their own, they're quite well developed, and they're not nearly as dependent as a lot of other animals are, for instance our own young. So when they're born, the young are already about 250 pounds, they're 3 feet tall, they can see, they can smell, within a few minutes or a few hours they're able to walk, although if you've ever seen videos of really young elephants you'll know that they aren't walking with all that much coordination, but they can in fact be mobile. And they then stay with their mothers for 2 to 4 years, and it's not until after this time that they are finally weaned. And that's why females do take quite a lot of time to have their next young, because they do have a lot of care that they put into the first one. And actually another interesting thing about the young, in addition to drinking the milk of their mothers, they can also eat their mother's dung. And this is something that obviously is not giving them access to whole lots of nutrients, because these guys tend to eat things that already don't have a lot of nutrients, and it's quite hard to digest. But they do have symbiotic bacteria that are passed through the gut and come out in the poo, basically. And so if the young will eat that, they can ingest those bacteria themselves, and that means that they will then have them in their stomachs and have the aid of the bacteria in the digestion of cellulose. And if they don't have these symbiotic organisms, it is much harder for them to get as much nutrition out of the same amount of food. So this is quite a useful thing for the young to be able to get this product from their mothers. And as I said earlier, the mothers do care for their offspring for quite a few years, but they aren't alone. And this is something you probably will have also seen if you've ever seen a nature documentary on elephants. So often there will be other females that will help, and these are called allomothers. And the allomothers are young females who are not yet reproductively active, or for some reason they don't have their own young. And so they will contribute, and they'll pitch in and try to help take care of the young. So they'll play with them, they might babysit them if the mother has to go off somewhere. They'll keep an eye on the young, and if they start to stray, they'll go off and retrieve them. And so basically it's kind of like what we have in our society when you've got the adolescent females that can be called on to help out in the case of a mother's attention being directed somewhere else. That was Ivory Joe's Boogie by Ivory Joe Hunter, and today we are talking about ivory in the context of elephants and elephant conservation. And again, just to remind you, in case you're just now tuning in, this is The Wild Side, and I'm your host, Caitlin Kight. So before the break, I was talking a little bit about some elephant natural history information, and the next thing I want to talk about is their behaviors that are related to cognition, because elephants are quite intelligent. This is why they've been domesticated in Asia for thousands of years, and why we know that they can be asked to do a variety of tasks, so things like drafting and hunting and transportation. Of course, they've been in circuses for ages. And it's quite interesting to think about elephant cognition, because this is one of the major reasons why people will say we need to conserve elephants. And I always pose the question to my students when we're talking about conservation as to whether, having a lot of cognitive abilities and being like humans is really a good enough reason to conserve something, and whether this means that other things like beetles and butterflies and fishes that don't show these things are not as meaningful as things like elephants. And of course I'm kind of being devil's advocate there a little bit, because these are really interesting characteristics, and it does in some cases maybe make a difference if the animals that we're worried about are aware of what's happening to them and suffering on kind of a mental or emotional level. But that's kind of a topic for another day. Anyway, I just want to introduce why it is important to think about these kind of intellectual traits of elephants. So I mentioned earlier that elephants have been known to engage in art, and this is actually quite an interesting story, because originally I thought that this was just kind of a gimmicky little thing that was done in order to get attention at zoos and to make some money. But actually it turns out that the reason that some of the first people who engaged in elephant artwork were interested in pursuing this was that they were looking at elephants that were held in captivity in circumstances that maybe weren't so stimulating. They didn't have anything to play with, or they didn't have any other elephants there with them to keep them company. And they noticed that sometimes the elephants would pick up a stick and maybe just kind of draw around in the dirt and kind of just drag it around and make little patterns, and they seemed to amuse themselves by doing this. And so they went in and they purchased some materials and put up canvases and brought out the paint and taught the elephants to hold the paintbrush in their very dexterous trunks. And it turned out that a lot of the elephants really seemed to enjoy this. And it wasn't just something where they would do it because things were given to them, but they kind of learned to indicate that they wanted the materials brought back to them. They seemed to show improvements over time in terms of how well they were able to kind of manipulate the things, and how basically how they were able to arrange the shapes and the colors on the canvas. They seemed to be able to kind of learn a sense of aesthetics in some way. And of course this is not very scientific, this is all very anecdotal, but it did seem to show quite a lot of improvement in how happy they were in captivity. And there was also some clear variation in different individuals. So some were more interested in this and others weren't. Some of them did show a lot of improvement and others didn't. And so this does seem to be kind of a very individualistic thing, in the same way that art in humans tends to be quite individualistic, and we all have our own different abilities and interests. And the pieces that are generated by these different schools and zoos and entities, basically, or organizations and companies that will put the elephants in kind of an art setting, all of these pieces tend to generate money for conservation and breeding programs as well. Some of them have even been sold through really prestigious auctioneers like Christie's. And so it's quite a nice thing where you can take this funding from what's kind of essentially just a fun and amusing sort of thing for us, but it can be put back into the elephants to take care of them both in captivity and in the wild. Now, getting back to the wild, another quite interesting thing about elephants is their signaling. So they do have dominance and submission displays. They display their dominance by raising their head and their trunk, also by raising their ears up and out and kind of snapping them or flapping them around. And they might also shake their heads and make trumpeting noises. And if you've ever been on the wrong side of a dominance display, it is very threatening, because these are quite large animals and they only seem to make themselves larger by doing all of this stuff. And actually one of the trips when I was in Kenya, our driver for some reason thought it would be amusing to kind of instigate a bit of a fight with an elephant to get it to run and show off. And I think that he thought we'd all like that because it would give us a good photo opportunity. But actually it was quite frightening because the elephant did all of these things and started to run after our truck. And you feel pretty safe when you're in a truck until you have a full-grown male elephant running after you, and then you realize that actually that truck is not all that sturdy. Now, if we had been another elephant, we might have been able to display our submission, and to do this, basically we would just turn around. So what you might think of, I mean, if a human did this to you, you'd find it quite rude, I think. But in elephants, the way that you show that you are not going to engage is to turn around and show your rear end to a dominant individual, to bring your ears down or to level them out rather than holding them up, and to also lower your head. And there are certain vocalizations as well that will indicate that you are being submissive rather than trying to be dominant. Now, another noise that elephants can make is rumbles. And these are extremely high amplitude noises, so something in the range of 90 to 100 decibels. And they also are incredibly low frequency, so 20 hertz or so, which is something that we really wouldn't be able to hear. And these vocalizations can transmit through the surface of the earth because they are such a low frequency and the wavelengths are a certain type of basically size and strength that they are really able to transmit through the soil. And they transmit differently depending on the substrate, but they can travel over amazing distances. So we're talking, thousands of meters here. And the elephants can detect these through a couple of different pathways. And these aren't 100% worked out yet, but it's either one of these or the other, or potentially both of them at the same time. So there is a bone conduction method in the middle of the ear, which is the same thing that we have. And there might also be some vibration of something called Pacinian corpuscles in their feet and their trunk. Now also in their feet they have these cartilaginous fat pads. And this makes a lot of sense for the elephants to use their feet to receive the noises, because as I said, they are transmitting through the surface of the earth. And since the feet are already there on the surface of the earth, then it makes quite a lot of sense to have these sensitive components, traits in the feet that would allow them to detect that change in vibration basically in the earth. And not only are they able to detect these noises, but they can also distinguish between different individuals and discriminate really tiny changes in frequency. So they are quite sensitive in being able to hear these really low frequency rumble sounds. Something else that you might have heard about elephants is that they have really terrific memories. And that's actually not just an old adage, it's also something that has been proven by science. So for instance, people have found that dominant females appear to build up what's been referred to as a social memory. And this allows them to recognize other individual elephants and remember what sort of interactions they had with them in the past. Were they pleasant interactions or bad interactions? Were these dominant individuals or submissive individuals? They also have really good memory for migratory routes, and this is information that they can pass on from one generation to the next. This is actually something that can be kind of problematic in a conservation context, because if you are a poacher and you go out and target the oldest individuals that have the biggest tusks, then you're also taking out of the population the individuals that know how to show the young where to go. And so you might have knowledge changing over time within a society of elephants because those individuals that could pass on that information are no longer around. And you might also find that individuals that have this very strong memory of a particular migratory route might be a bit confused if they turn up and find that there's a wall in the way, for instance. This is actually something that I saw on a documentary about a year or so ago, where they radio collared these elephants and they found out that they were trying to pursue this old migratory route, but there was a really big retaining wall between countries. And so they would go up to the wall and just walk back and forth because the females in the lead knew that they had to get across and they just didn't know how to do it. So this really long-term memory can actually make them be a bit less flexible than you might like to hope. Now elephants are also known for having quite a long and intensive grieving and mourning process that's very similar to that found in humans. And they're seen to examine and inspect the bodies of deceased elephants and also to visit elephant graveyards. And they'll spend lots of time and energy finding leaves and twigs and other things that they can use to bury the dead once the individuals have died. And often, years after death, they'll revisit a site where a death has occurred and stay there for long periods of time as if they're contemplating and remembering. Now, of course, it's hard for us to exactly interpret what's going on, but it does seem to be quite a peculiar thing for animals to show this amount of care and interest in these types of sites. So it's kind of hard to attribute it to something else other than kind of a mourning process. And their body language also clearly indicates quite a lot of dejection. So they have sunken eyes and drooping ears and an overall lack of energy. And there was actually a great story, although also sad, earlier this year. There was a man called the Elephant Whisperer who was an elephant conservationist in South Africa. And he had lived with the elephants that he was helping to rescue very closely, but they had never been to his house. And he was at his house when he died. He was quite an old man at this time. And the elephants that had never been there suddenly showed up. They walked miles and miles to get there, and they all stayed around his house for a couple of days and just stood there and seemed to hold a vigil, and then they took off again. And so this is quite an extraordinary and very odd circumstance where they seemed to sense somehow that he had died, and they had come to treat him in the same way they might have treated one of their own. Now, one of the reasons that elephants are really important is that they do have quite a very strong relationship with their habitat, and they are a big influence on the habitat around them. Now, although they're normally diurnal, which means that they're out during the day, they may also become quite nocturnal where the human disturbance has become a factor, so when it's quite common or very intense. And I mentioned earlier that the herds will roam over large areas of land where they can, and during this time they'll consume hundreds of pounds of plant matter. But these days, when they're kind of shoved into a few small areas, this is not quite the same process as it used to be, and so this can put a big strain on the habitat. Because they are often competing with humans and livestock for the same resources, and they're taking a whole lot of vegetation out of the habitat. And some people regard this as being good because they're helping succession, so they're taking out certain plants and allowing others to grow. And other people are quite worried about it because they think maybe in these concentrated areas, these elephants might actually be taking out too much habitat. So there are some parks, for instance, in South Africa where they now have thousands and thousands of elephants. And there is potentially a concern because if these same elephants are in the same place all the time, they're always taking stuff out of the habitat and it's not able to regenerate quite enough. But generally speaking, the elephant activity can help maintain ecosystems. So it can influence forest composition because they'll spread seeds through their dung, and the seeds need to be passed through the digestive tract of an elephant before they can actually sprout. And this is actually true of about 1/3 of all tree species in the Central African forest, so there is a very strong relationship between the elephants and the trees. They also affect vegetation density, as I said, because they are eating lots of food, so they can open up gaps and encourage regeneration. And then in the savannas, they can reduce bush cover because they'll eat certain things, but also they'll rub up against them in order to kind of scratch themselves. And this can create a really good environment because it allows both browsers and grazers to get access to the foods that they need. That was Damien Rice singing Elephant, and I'm sure you'll notice we've had a change of scenery. Now I'm recording here in my study at home. That's because there was a bit of a technical problem with the camera when I was recording live in the studio on Wednesday, and so now I've had to finish up here in order to make the full recording to discuss this one last topic that I wanted to address about elephants. And earlier, before the break, we were talking about their natural history, and now I want to switch over a little bit and think about some of the problems that elephants are facing and how their natural history may kind of play into causing some of these problems and promoting some of these issues, but also potentially finding some solutions to some of these difficulties that they're having now in conservation kind of aspects. So, natural threats to elephants, there are few, although of course full-grown adults you don't think are very susceptible to lots of predators. There are a few predators that can target ones that aren't feeling very well, that are a little bit smaller, that are maybe kind of separated from the rest of the herd. So things like lions and tigers are actually capable of bringing down an elephant, particularly when they're working together. And baby elephants are the ones that are at the biggest risk, and these could be targeted by the cats that I mentioned, as well as by things like hyenas. And elephants are actually quite famous for having a very adapted response to these sorts of predators. So whenever their young are targeted, they'll put the young in the center and then form up a circle around them and protect them from the predators that are kind of out around the periphery of the circle. But of course, the biggest threats to elephants are humans. And this actually goes back several hundreds, probably thousands of years. So basically, as soon as humans kind of figured out how to make tools and work together in packs, we were hunting elephants. And this is true not just in Africa and in Asia, but also, of course, where we had things like woolly mammoths that early humans were known to hunt. Now, currently, we have a lot of issues with the hunting of elephants, and a lot of these are particularly related to poaching associated with the ivory trade. But some people are also interested in elephants because they are quite a huge source of meat. So if a village has a few people that go out together and bring down an elephant, they can kind of pitch in and then share a whole lot of meat that will keep them fed for quite a long time. Now, the international trade in ivory has been banned for about 30 years now, but there are some domestic areas where ivory trade is actually legalized, and so this does keep the market going. And there is, of course, quite a whole lot of smuggling that goes on of illegal ivory, and Asia is a particularly hot market for these sorts of items. And this is kind of a problem because although some of the items that are sold for ivory can be used just to kind of show off how wealthy you are and to make, beautiful handles on knives or combs for your hair, various sorts of things, some of these products are also associated with religion. So there are ivory crucifixes, for example, and other sorts of artifacts that are used in worship. They're important in both the Christian faith and in the Buddhist faith and in various other kind of local older religions. And so this can be a really big problem because if you've got people who believe that ivory is something that's of religious significance, it's going to be a lot harder to dissuade them and tell them that actually God would prefer if you didn't go slaughter that elephant, because this is something that's very rooted in their belief system. And people right now are quite interested in figuring out what to do about the ivory problem because this is killing thousands of elephants, we think, probably, each year. And one of the things that's been developed is this really interesting DNA technique where they can test the elephants in a particular region and then test the ivory that shows up somewhere else and figure out where those elephants were killed. So for instance, there was a recent haul of ivory from Singapore and another one in Hong Kong, and they were able to take these things and look at the DNA and locate the original source of this ivory, which is a bunch of elephants that were down in Zambia and kind of along the Congo. And so then they can make sure that they're targeting the right areas in Africa at the source in order to prevent these deaths from occurring to begin with. So rather than just relying on discovering the ivory after the elephant has already died and after the ivory has arrived at its destination, they can now target the source and try to keep people from killing those elephants to begin with. Now there are also lots of other conflicts with humans. So elephants are really well known for trampling crops and eating crops in agricultural areas. And they can also potentially come into contact with humans in kind of an aggressive way and have these encounters where people do wind up dead. So there's a lot of interest in coming up with these mitigation techniques that just keep elephants away from people and away from their crops. And a couple of really neat innovations have been established in Kenya, where people will plant now chilies, and also they'll have they'll have apiaries where they have bees that are producing honey, and they'll put those around the outside of a field. So then the elephants will smell the chilies and be deterred, and they'll leave without having eaten what's in the center of the field. Or they'll reach the edge of the field and they'll encounter the bees and they'll turn around and leave, because elephants don't like bees any more than we do. And so in addition to keeping the elephants away from the crops, these things also give the farmers something else that they can make money off of. So they can sell the chilies, they can sell the honey, and that's an additional source of income for them. And so far these methods have actually been shown to work really well and to provide kind of a long-term economic benefit for the communities. So there are people who are really interested in rolling out these sorts of solutions, very natural solutions and quite easy to do, over a larger scale, not just in Kenya but elsewhere as well. And of course education is another big thing that could be targeted in order to try to help elephant populations. So teaching communities about techniques like this, but also telling them about elephant natural history, kind of maybe highlighting the sorts of points that would be useful to know whenever you are going to encounter elephants a lot, things that maybe could reduce the amount of conflict, or learning things about them in order to keep them out of your fields. Just an example of the sort of thing that might be useful to people is that we've now found that elephants will teach each other sorts of habits. And so if you've got these young males that form these kind of loose friendships, and they might be found with another young male, they often will learn sort of tricks off of each other. So if you've got one of them that has a tendency to eat in an agricultural field, it might teach the other one to do a similar thing. So if we know this sort of thing and tell people about this sort of thing, then they'll recognize that they don't need to go out and kill every single elephant if there is one eating in their field, but maybe instead they'll just target the one that's teaching the others the bad habits. Or they'll know that if they just target that pair that seems to be showing these behaviors over and over again, then maybe they don't have to worry about these other elephants that are in the area but are paying more attention to kind of natural sources of food. So just little life history details like that, and just kind of educating people about why it is that elephants are really important. You know, trying to figure out a way to persuade them that these are actually better kept alive than dead. So for instance, maybe showing them the statistics of how much money that brings in terms of ecotourism each year, and helping them figure out a way in order to make some of those ecotourist dollars themselves. Now, another problem is habitat loss and degradation, and this is something that's really affecting elephants hugely, especially in Africa, because there's a lot of urbanization going on. The human population is growing exponentially, and so it's cutting off the places where elephants can live. They're pretty much pushed into areas of, parks where they're being kind of kept by managers, and they have people that are there to protect them. And there's not a whole lot of space in between these areas where they're able to kind of move along their natural migratory routes. So you have them isolated, they're unable to breed with each other or travel the way that they would. They're maybe eating too many resources in one place, they don't have a way to go elsewhere and kind of recycle the ground the way they used to. So they're maybe running out of food sources after a while, and degrading the habitat for other organisms as well. And even those places where they are now living kind of in security, humans are encroaching on those as well, and degrading the habitat in other ways through pollution or encroachment because they're trying to build homes. So there is this conflict between humans and elephants in terms of who's going to get the land and what are we going to allow the elephants to do with the land that they do have. Now, there unfortunately is a big lack of data on kind of pre-1800s elephant populations, because of course, people weren't in Africa studying elephants extensively then. And so we don't really know what it was like when there were tens of millions of elephants roaming around. We don't know what kind of impact they had on the ecosystem. We don't know what sort of population fluctuations they had and how many of them could be sustained in the area. And so we really don't know what to expect as we try to help elephant populations rebound. So it's kind of estimated that there may have been well over 10 million elephants before we went in kind of in the 19th century and slaughtered them all when we were hunting for ivory and for meat. And now we've got this population of maybe 50,000, 75,000. We're trying to increase that, but we don't know what to expect when that happens. We don't know what it was like there before, and we don't even know if this is going to be possible. But it's quite a difficult thing to do to achieve all of this kind of conservation and management if you don't know what sorts of things to look for and what sorts of patterns to expect. So that does make all of this kind of conservation work much more difficult. So currently, unfortunately, poaching is quite intense, and populations are back on the decline. So after poaching, after the ivory trade was outlawed a couple decades ago, things got a lot better for the elephants, and they kind of stabilized and started to increase. But now things are about as bad as they were then, if not worse, and the population seems to be falling again. And it looks like, as much as most people can estimate, it looks as though they're going to need an influx of money and of help in order to make the populations rebound in the way that they previously did, and to try to get them back on track for that kind of recovery that we were aiming for to begin with. We probably won't ever get back to 10 million elephants, there's just no space for them anymore, but we certainly can have more than we have now. But probably to achieve that, we're going to need people to donate money and to recognize that elephants haven't been saved. We do need to keep working on elephant conservation. We need to have volunteers and organizations that will go in and protect the elephants and work out kind of innovative ways to allow both humans and elephants to use the land together. And so when I update the Wildside webpage, I'm going to make sure I put a bunch of links in case any of you guys are interested in going to some of these websites and checking out these organizations and maybe donating some money to the cause. But certainly a good first step to that is just learning a bit more about elephants and understanding kind of the role that they play and why they're interesting, and passing that information on. And that's why I did the show today and Wednesday, of course, since this is now 2 days. And I hope you enjoy it, and I hope you share it with your friends, and maybe together everyone can kind of help the elephants. That's it for this week, and I will see you next week.